Good morning, wherever you might be and whatever time of the day it might be. Uh, Apologies for not appearing live online as I initially had planned to. Turned out to be somewhat difficult. I'm in two conferences at the moment, and at the moment I'm in Bergen, Norway, where we also have a lovely conference on early childhood and sustainability hosted by Elin Eriksson Ødegaard. And that is also demanding all of my time a little bit. And so I'm trying to kind of make up for not being there by recording this in my hotel room in the evening here in Norway. Um, Hopefully, it will still be somewhat informative or maybe generative for the conversations that hopefully follow. Let me first acknowledge the network, the TND network, which has been going on for quite some time and actually quite influential, I think, in developing new ideas and very generative in engaging conversations about early childhood education and care, but especially in the Anthropocene. So thank you, Eva and Barbara and Linda and Sue and Sule for co-convening the network, and I hope that the ideas for the next, the 8.0, will be fruitful as well. So a whole child in a whole school, in a whole community, in a troubled world. That's kind of how I adopt my title for my talk, how to develop a more critical relational perspective. And some of you are familiar with my work, and it may sound familiar. This conference here in Bergen is for me also a reason, or a good reason to kind of reconnect with early childhood and care, education and care, which I have been I won't say neglected for a while, but I have been away from it, and it's good to turn back to it as I realized how the formative years in a young child, in a young adult, are so crucial in establishing kind of a foundation, a fertile foundation for unfolding the potential, the sustainability potential of young people in the future, which I think um, remains very critical. So I'm saying nothing new when saying that the crisis that we find ourselves in, the systemic global dysfunction, is in a way a kind of a perfect storm of multiple crises that are all interconnected and have to do with how one single species is altering major systems that have been formed over billions of years in less than maybe 200-300 years. And it's not like all humans are responsible for this, but particular ways of thinking that have been cultivated and have been exported and have led to colonization of everything and commodification of everything, even of the mind. And this is a big concern. Some people talk about the Anthropocene, some about the Capitalocene, which might be a better way of framing it. In any case, these nested systems can only be addressed by looking at them from a kind of an interrelated, interdependent perspective. We know that there is a lot of evidence about the runaway climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and I always, in a tongue-in-cheek way, point out that the biodiversity is collapsing and it's declining rapidly, whereas at the same time the consumer product diversity is increasing exponentially, and it's a kind of a huge contradiction how we kind of replace the biodiversity with product diversity. And a lot of people who are highly educated work on innovation continuously to come up with new products, to help companies grow, expand, gain market share. And education in many ways has become an extension of the globalizing economy. The hidden curriculum of our schools and university is one of preparing for the global economy. and enabling people to become consumers 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And here you have a picture I sometimes use to show the enormous diversity of hair products in any store around the globe, really. And even we have a great variety in some parts of the world of dog shampoos or for pet animals. And you might, on the one hand, we should celebrate that we recognize that other species also, like dogs, have different needs and need to be cared for in a good way. But at the same time, it also illustrates how we use innovation to develop market shares and niches, and that some of the smartest people on earth are helping extend or accelerate unsustainability. And people, the young adults, but especially young children who are also targeted by this consumerism and are also inundated in technologies that are often connected to the globalizing market. Um, Already more than 15 years ago, Juliet Shore wrote in Born to Buy about young children in Canada, not even 4 years old, who could distinguish over 100 different brands. I think it was close to 200 brands even at that very young age. Children nowadays are targeted all the time by hidden ads on social media, and it becomes even more problematic when parents kind of outsource parenting to these technologies, where they can kind of park their child behind a screen, a tablet, having them play what they think are educational games, but in a way introducing them in the world of consumerism. And it's Susan Lin's book on big tech as co-parents that kind of exposes this trend in society. And she shows that how tech companies like Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Snapchat have kind of morphed into a society-wide incarnation of the brothers Grimm monsters, she says. And they pose as caregivers, cultivate affection and attachment in children, use psychological insights to prey on their weaknesses, patiently fatten them up, meaning training them in consumption, all the while viewing children as profit centers. Now, this is, of course, quite alarming, and it's quite, you could say, any time a child is spending meaningfully in the outdoors or playing without these technologies, away from screens, where their eyeball attention is not captured by something fast moving on a screen, is time that is that can be spent more meaningfully in connecting with the people, with other species, but also with the places where they live. And we're losing that time. And I've seen wonderful examples yesterday here in Bergen at the conference of young children growing up in a relatively safe environment where they can explore and roam freely in their local environment away from these technologies. And I realize that is quite a privileged position these children are in, and their parents are probably very happy with the care they are being given by and the possibilities these children have to unfold their own identity and being. At the same time, young people are also aware. They pick things up. They're sensitive to emotions, and they also hear about climate change. Here's a drawing from children in Vietnam in the Mekong Delta who make drawings of floods that occur as a result of extreme weather events with torrential rains that were there before, but not at that kind of magnitude as they sometimes face today. And this volatile weather, sometimes very dry, sometimes very wet, is really affecting the livelihoods of these people. And the children are aware of this and they worry about this. And there's a lot of also in our part of the world, where I am now, in Europe and also I think in the global north as well. And also probably in Australia too, there's a lot of climate anxiety. And young people are anxious about what's coming, and they don't feel their education is preparing them very well for what's coming. In fact, what's already there for many. Part of the problem, I think, is that we have a tradition in education in the last, ever since Renaissance, the Renaissance of trying to simplify matters, trying to organize things, making them neat, drawing boundaries, making categories, and nowadays kind of expressing opinions using just a few words, one-liners, tweets, and since we are inundated with so much information, a lot of people look for simple answers where they can ask Siri or Alexis on their phones for an answer, and they don't really have to think anymore. But the problem is that these wicked problems that we are facing, they actually don't require simplification. They require that we complicate things, that we make clear that things are uncertain and that we do have to deal with different vantage points, different perspectives, different disciplinary backgrounds, ever evolving insights and ideas, and that we cannot really predict, manage, control what is going to happen. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is when we avoid it altogether. So this is part of the problem, is that we are kind of stuck humans, you might say, in dysfunctional systems that make living unsustainable lives easy and living sustainable lives very difficult. The default is one of detachment, it's one of commodification, it's one of denial, it's one of simplification, and the default should be one of asking critical questions, of indeed also learning to disrupt some of these systems and having a critical perspective in a time where we've witnessed a lot of polarization on the one hand and the blurring of boundaries on the other. The contradiction that we are facing today, the fluidity that we see everywhere, also in like gender fluidity, but at the same time we see polarization. Critical thinking, transgressive learning, resistance pedagogy are kind of a new phenomena that invite going against the grain. And we see some of this kind of disobedience and going against the grain. We see this in children also, when they kind of experiment doing things that they're not supposed to be doing. We also see it with young people, resisting, going on school strikes and things like that. Young adults beginning to ask difficult questions about climate change or about eating meat, things like that, that are beginning to make put a dent into these resilient, unhealthy systems. So this is this demands that we create a space also in early childhood for being a little bit disruptive, questioning the normal, allowing things to be questioned, and allowing to not take things for granted all the time, and to question routines every now and then. And this is a healthy soil, you might say, for developing a critical citizenship that can also begin transformation of these systems. And we see signs of this everywhere. Sometimes it is through creative processes using the arts. Sometimes it's also using technology like virtual reality glasses, where the iAnimal tool, for instance, where you can walk through an industrial pigsty and see how 24,000 pigs live together in this kind of you might call it deep, not dehumanizing, but I don't know. There's no word for that, but in a way that is completely unnatural in every aspect, and it's kind of making people rather uncomfortable. But if you do this in a good way, it allows for young people to, and not just young people, adults as well, to become uncomfortable together. And we need to also become comfortable with being uncomfortable. That sounds a little odd maybe, but by being uncomfortable together, we can begin to interrogate some of these unhealthy, unsustainable practices that are all around us, that are often invisible from us, held invisible from us. So a transition perspective is critical. How do we move away from the normalized, unsustainable practices where one single species thinks it can control and dominate everything, and it stands above all other animals and other species, and thinks it can even steward the world? And how do we kind of decenter the human? I think post-humanists are beginning to really make a dent, or not a dent, are beginning to make a counter movement that is gaining some traction around the world. That's important. How do we transition towards a more sustainable world, and what is the role of education and early childhood education in this? I think many of you are familiar with Kate Raworth and the donut economy. I really like, in a way, this idea of how do we learn to live within the donut, where the outskirts represent the ecological ceiling or the planetary boundaries that we need to learn within. If we don't do that, we have overshoot. So this has to do with all these ecological processes and systems that have been formed over billions of years that are now shifting and spiraling out of control if we don't act quickly. But also, how do we have that social foundation that allows for a dignified, meaningful life where there is equality, there's fairness, there's justice, there's peace, there's democracy, there's also healthy food, there's also good education, gender equality, peace and justice, all these things that we need to become self-actualized, fulfilled members of society, of a community, where we can have well-being psychologically and physically. Without that, if we don't have that, we can also not mean much for the world outside us. So there's a connection between what some call inner sustainability and outer sustainability. They go hand in hand. And the Sustainable Development Goals, they connect to this donut. Some are more on the outskirts, some are more in the middle. And I think these goals, they do have more impact in schools, in policy, than, say, the Millennium Development Goals. I think because they're closely connected to existential issues that we all recognize. And that affect both the global north and the global south, where the Millennium Development Goals tended to be focused singly on the global south in a kind of colonial way. The SDGs also have that risk. We need to be critical of them too. When we say decent work and economic growth, you might question why economic growth? Who put that in there? why not decent work and a regenerative or a circular economy? No poverty, everybody agrees, but if it were no extreme wealth inequality, people would start resisting that, and it would become political in a way, and people try to leave it out because it would upset existing power relationships. But having no extreme wealth inequality as an SDG might be very effective in fighting or realizing SDG 1, no poverty. So these two are, critical, need to be critically approached, scrutinized. What we do, I've been in this field of environmental and sustainability education for, I suppose, 30 years already, maybe more if you include the time I spent as a student working on some of these issues. And if I kind of look back, then in the early part of my career, going to using Stephen Sterling's responses to sustainability, it was quite. We spent a lot of time trying to get a foot in the door in schools, from kindergarten through secondary education, vocational education, higher education, to kind of point at the importance of addressing issues around climate, biodiversity, and later also social justice, environmental justice, things like that. And schools sometimes you would find an interesting teacher or a school leader or a school that had a vision that would work with that. But overall, the response was very weak. There was a lot of denial, and not a response. People tended to focus on what was required in the national curriculum, for instance, and that national curriculum often did not talk about this either. Nowadays, I do see a shift, and not just in the Netherlands or in Norway or in Sweden, where I have spent a lot of my working life in the last, say, 10 years, but all over. Schools, early childhood care centers, universities, vocational schools, all around the whole spectrum are asking themselves, how can we remain relevant to today's world? How can we become more responsive to today's question? How can we become more responsible in terms of what we strengthen in the world and what we might be silencing or weakening in the world? What does it imply for how we work as an organization? What kind of capacities and competencies and qualities do we need to nurture in our organization? It's becoming not so much an add-on, it's becoming more a catalyst of innovation and change. So in that sense, I'm somewhat optimistic that there is now, after so many years, a kind of a movement and a general recognition that education as usual is no longer an option. And we have done some research over the years to look at what are then the key components of education in relation to sustainability and, for that matter, climate change. Climate change, I think we talk about climate urgency, climate action, climate change education. Climate change is symptomatic for these deeper global systemic dysfunctions that have to do with the dominance, the separation of human from the rest. It has to do with this growth and innovation-oriented way of thinking, where expansion and power imbalances are kind of the motor of our current system, that are completely, well, like I've said several times already, dysfunctional. So here I don't have the time to talk about all of them now this morning, and it's online and so not so dynamic to keep you all alert and attentive. So I won't talk about all of these, and many of you are already familiar with them. But obviously values and ethics and the moral compass, we need to reflect on that. We need to also expose the values and ethics that we are implicitly working with. Often we don't recognize that our current curriculum is very much normative as well, the conventional curriculum, where sometimes I hear sustainability working on things like climate, environmental justice, and so on is very normative, and I always bounce back. Working on expanding the economy and only serving the economy at the expense of people and planet is also very normative. But that's kind of accepted as it goes without saying that we should work on that. Well, that needs to change. Diversity, dissonance, becoming uncomfortable, feeling a little bit uneasy, but also inviting different perspectives and trying to find some common ground sometimes in the difficult middle, sometimes is necessary. How do we do that? Agency, giving opportunities to act, to experiment, to make mistakes, to learn from the attempt, developing the transformative capacity within yourself, but also to change things around you. Very important, but also changing the structures that make doing that difficult. So otherwise we cannot just blame all this or put the entire responsibility of all this on the individual. That also wouldn't be right and unfair, because then we leave the bigger systems and the kind of the corporate structures that invite unsustainability intact, and in a way it's then a distraction from doing that. Change and transitions, the difference between optimizing what we have, doing the things we do better, versus transitioning towards new values and principles that are more regenerative, that are healthier, that are more in tune with other species, with future generations, and so on, which is not so much about doing better things, but it's doing things better. It's about doing better things altogether. And lastly, boundary crossing and systems thinking. I already mentioned the fluidity, the convergence of different perspectives and different sectors in society, where we can no longer just talk about climate, we must also talk about water and biodiversity and energy and gender. And we must talk about all these things if we're going to really have an effective response to these wicked challenges. One thing that I do want to flag, I already mentioned the importance of the outdoors, connecting with place, immersing yourself in your local environment to establish a strong connection, and to if you don't have that, why would you care for that place? This is a classic study. Some of you may already have heard of it. It's not new. It's already quite an old study. I think it was done in the 90s. But this shows how the place to roam freely and to explore on your own for children is shrinking rapidly. This is in Sheffield in the United Kingdom, where George, great-grandfather George, at the age of 8, could walk around about 6 miles in a radius from his home to go fishing. And people would just, parents would just trust that nothing would happen to George and he would return around dinner time. And maybe he got lost in the fishing and may have gotten home late every now and then, but nobody would really worry about him. And that space has really shrunk. Grandfather Jack, at age 8 in the 1950s, was only allowed to walk 1 mile. And Mother Vicky, when she was 8 in the late 70s, was allowed to only walk to the swimming pool half a mile away. And their son Ed, who was 8 at this time, it was like 1990, was only allowed to walk on his own to the end of the street. And this is everywhere today too. I mean, now we see lots of young children being brought to school by their parents in a car, and they are not either for maybe there's traffic, but there might also be other kinds of dangers, and as a result, a lot of young children do not know really where they live, and that's a concern. How can we open up these spaces where children can roam freely and explore their local environment also when they're younger, and develop the kind of capacities, qualities that you need in order to connect with the place. This picture I've used also, I think, for maybe 15 years already. It's not mine. I don't know whoever made it, but it's a very, it remains a powerful picture where we show, on the left that we're very good at categorizing, boxing, drawing boundaries, making distinctions, and we're not very good at seeing connections, relationships, and that we see how a lot of qualities, competencies, agencies are emergent properties of relationships. And we need to create spaces where we can connect, relate, um, where we invite connections. And that is hugely important if we want to have more holistic, integrative approaches to these wicked problems. And a lot of young people, I think, and most children, they already have a kind of an innate ability to see the world as the world unfolds. They don't see the world in categories, disciplines, boxes. That's how they are being cultivated, and often the more time they spend in schools, the better they get at that. But they lose that kind of ability to see connections and relationships. So how do we kind of create environments that allow for the building of the constructions and the co-creation of these relationships is an important question, I think. I promised something about this whole school, whole institution, whole university, whole early school approach. And again, some of these ideas are not new. Some are from health education, some are from citizenship education, and some are from education in the context of sustainability. But they all converge in around this idea that we need to not add on these topics, but that we need to have kind of an integrative, systemic response where we revisit all the core elements of the learning ecology that schools represent. So we need to look at this flower with the different petals, and at the heart, the vision, the ethos, the kind of leadership and coordination that is needed in these schools. So really briefly, because I'm already at a half an hour and I don't want to take too much of your time, but if we go kind of past these different petlets, or petals, I should say, looking at the curriculum now, the curriculum I see as kind of the core activities taking place in a center, in a school, in a university. And in some places it's rather formalized, prescribed. But the way I like to talk about it more is how Bill Pinar from University of British Columbia, the way he talks about it is as a complicated conversation that needs to be it's a dialogue that needs to take place in the school, in the center, with staff, with children, with the young people. And when he talks about staff, it's teaching staff, it's management staff, but also other staff in the schools, people who are working on the grounds or working in the canteen or cleaning the building. They too are staff, and they need to be part of that conversation as well if we want to talk about sustainability. A localized, place-based set of activities responsive to what emerges, what children bring, and it also needs to be balanced in terms of socialization. What do we find are important values and maybe norms that we agree to together, that we feel are worth handing over in a way, but also qualification in terms of the capacities, competencies, skills, qualities that are needed, and that can be having to do with dealing with complexity and uncertainty, but also asking moral questions, engaging in moral dilemmas, ethical questions, and subjectification, which a colleague of mine from the Netherlands, many of you know him, Gert Biesta, he talks about these three functions of education, where subjectification has to do with being and becoming. Who am I in the world? Who do I want to be in the world? What keeps me from becoming who I am in the world? And what can I mean for the world? And this is, and I like to add eco to all three of them, because socialization that is at the expense of ecology and other species is problematic. The same of qualification. If those qualities are used to kind of accelerate unsustainability, then we're not really helping people and planet. And subjectification, that is at the expense of the subjectification of others or of the planet, is also problematic. You could even say that the Earth itself has a right of subjectification. The Earth wants to follow, in a way, its own trajectory, but right now the trajectory is disturbed tremendously by what humans are doing to the planet. So we are compromising the subjectification of the planet, you might say. Gert Rieste isn't talking about it in that way, but he is becoming, I find, in his latest work, more in tune with these existential sustainability challenges that we are facing as a species, but as the Earth as a whole, as a result of the way humans are treating each other and the Earth. So there's lots of possibilities for this more localized, this more investigative way of looking at rainwater harvesting in communities in the Netherlands here on the left, looking at benthic organisms and learning about how they indicate water quality in the local stream and river, understanding a little bit not just the hydrology but also the aquatic quality of the ecosystem. Let me move on here. I'm not sure why I'm not getting to the next slide. Of becoming connected to circularity, extending the lifetime of things, and becoming more connected to matter. Pedagogy and learning, these are also familiar to all of you. More inquiry, curiosity-based, values-based, a pedagogy of care, where we learn to care for things around us and ourselves, where we provide opportunities for caring in the classroom, in the local environment. Place-based, immersive, situated learning. One of my PhDs, supervised with Kok Bakker from the University Utrecht and George Lenke, has come up with this wonderful thesis on the pedagogy of entanglement. And recently we are also thinking, this is about how we are all connected to everything, and that we cannot escape this entanglement, but we're not really aware of it. And this realizing how we are entangled and immersed in our surroundings, and how also in how nature is a part of us and we are part of nature, is critical as a stepping stone towards sustainability. At the same time, there's also what I've kind of named as stranglement, where we are kind of choking in the system that makes it almost impossible to sense that entanglement and to live in a more entangled way, to become more in tune in that safe space of humanity that Kate Raworth talks about. Embodied forms of learning are also, and this happens a lot in the early years, but why only in the early years? Also like to point out at work done by a former PhD of mine, and that also Ingrid Pramlim Samuelsson helped kick off in his study on reconfiguring environmental sustainability in early childhood, where Kasahun used the post-anthropocentric approach, which I think is a fascinating thesis, and of course the work of Karen Malone and Amy Cutler McKenzie and Elizabeth Barrett Hacking on the Child Nature Handbook, with wonderful contributions from all over the world, as well as the Children in the Anthropocene book that that Karen did earlier. These are streams that are gaining traction in early childhood, and that begin to trouble these dichotomies that we have created over the years. More examples. This is a typical school, you might say nowadays, which is not a bad thing, where they set up their own recycling. But the point is not so much the recycling. The point is that the young people in this school, and these are older kids again, but I think we can imagine also in early childhood how these similar practices might be unfolded there. They come up with the system. They think about what might work, where will our peers, what will they respond to? And not just that, they build it also. On the right side, you see that they build these structures, and as a result of building them and contemplating them, they are much more connected to the practices, and as a result, their peers are more likely to use it in a good way. So it becomes part of the not just the ethos and the bridging, the thinking and the doing. It becomes enacted practices that are meaningful. And that's important also, that the school, the center, becomes kind of a living or a microcosm of a more sustainable way of living. And that means that they need to enact sustainable, equitable, healthy, and democratic ways of being in the school, and that all in the school can participate in. Needless to say that the greening of school grounds, working with ground, with soil, taking care of plants and crops, and growing your own vegetables, these are things that are not new, but we do see a revival of them all over, and the urban greening movement is quite strong, and schools are often closely connected to them, and this is important to create these green spaces that can also be used as a local laboratory for exploration, for connecting, and so on. The connection with the community, with actors that are in the community, NGOs, it could also be parents who have certain expertise, but also circular enterprises, alternative groups that work on closing cycles. How do you connect with these actors? How can you create synergies between them? How do you broker and nurture good relationships? And how can the surroundings of a school, of a center, become living resources for unfolding everyone's sustainability potential? These are critical questions. Professional development. What are these competencies and qualities that the caregivers, the providers, the teachers need to have in order to allow for empathy, compassion, changing perspectives, diversity to come in, to deal also with tensions, with contradictions, with hypocrisy sometimes, what kind of pedagogical qualities does that require, and how and where can they be developed? What is the role of professional development in this? And what is your center or school doing in this regard? I have here with me, I have some of the, this is in Norwegian and you probably can't see it, but we have developed this kind of toolkit with the different petals of the flower that we use in workshops with teachers. Here you have some teachers from the Norwegian schools that we work with in the south of Norway near Ås. And all these petals are used on a big sheet of butcher paper, or it's maybe not a good word anymore, butcher paper, but where they look at what do we already do, what are we good at, and where might we need to put in a little bit more effort. And this works very well, and it's part of the university school connections and the professional development and the kind of the co-investigating of how the whole system can change. That is quite a powerful way of professional development and school change, innovation, and navigating kind of complexity that comes with that is what this project is really about. And if you want to hear more about this, we have developed very recently this little booklet on whole school approaches, critical case studies from around the world, where we have exemplary practices where the people in these practices also reflect on what's not working and what's challenging and what do you need to do to overcome these challenges. Okay, I'm at the end really. At the heart of the flower, it is about what kind of ethos, what kind of vision do we have as a community, what kind of leadership does it require? And these kinds of questions need to be asked continuously, not as a kind of a statement on a website, but as a living kind of practice that is based on a kind of ethic that people want to work on together. And that is a very important part of this approach. Lastly, maybe a few words on hope. It's easy to fall into doom and gloom thinking, which we must avoid, and how to create these more hopeful perspectives by engaging young people in working locally on issues that they can affect, that they can relate to, that they can invite themselves, and that they can feel that they can actually have some influence, and nurturing that the relationship that will allow for agency to be formed is very critical. The Rewilding Education for a New Earth by Michael Poulsen and others from the Southern Denmark University is very interesting. It provides very hopeful perspectives. And also the work of Emma Woodward on cultivating hope in the age of global threats, where she works with more traumatized children, but it's also very inspiring work. In the end, we hope to what UNESCO calls to create a living school where sustainability is not just something to learn, it's something to live. And here you see kind of what such a school or a place might look like. It's very rich, it's very green, it's very, it spans different forms of teaching and learning, and it utilizes the place as an important source for well-being, not just of the individuals, but of the system as a whole. With that, thank you, and again, apologies for not being with you. I've tried to keep it within 50 minutes. I think I might just make that. I always admire people who can sit behind the screen for so long. If you have questions, you know where to find me. I would be happy to answer them. I wish you a very good continuation of the network, and I hope that we will see each other also live again one of these days. Thank you very much. My email is on the lower left, and also the blog where I sometimes post on some of the things I'm talking about is available. Thank you again, and have a very good day, evening or morning, wherever it might be for you.